Hello, I'm H.I. Sutton, and I'm going to give a talk on open source intelligence for HackTheSea at DEF CON. It's very honoured to be invited. This is a pre-recorded chat, so we'll see how that goes. The topic is going to be about what the public knows about Russia's new Mega-Submarine. This story really is how we know it, the open source intelligence story. Before I go into more about who I am, I just want to do a little bit of scene setting. Back in 2015, there was a very notable leak, from the Russian government. And President Putin, he's the chap in the blue suit, if you don't follow the news, he had a meeting clearly fed, clearly sanitized. Partway through that meeting, in the televised segments of it, there is some shoulder surfing, and we can actually see one of the slides that they were discussing. And this is explosive stuff, because what they're talking about is a new super weapon, a nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed torpedo. That was 5.5 years ago. And I'm sure many other people have spent 5.5 years trying to figure out what it's all about and how much we can learn about the systems and submarines involved. So that's what the talk's going to be about. I am H.I. Sutton. I'm on Twitter at Covert Shores, and I'm an open source intelligence analyst, essentially. I have to forewarn you, I tend to say OSINT rather than OSINT, so apologies if that it causes you any issues, but I'm sure you can forgive me. The open source intelligence I'm going to be talking about is maybe a little bit different to some of the other topics. I'm going to talk mostly about satellites today, and similar sort of image intelligence. More about me, I have a website called covertshores.com. I mostly write about submarines or uncrewed underwater vehicles, mini subs, narco subs particularly as well. So naval warfare, but obscure stuff, not the same stuff that you'll find on most other websites. I write for navalnews.com, US Naval Institute News, and I have in the past written for other sites as well. I have a couple of books on submarines, how to recognize them, narco subs, how to recognize those. So if you discover a narco sub at the end of your garden, I've got a book for you that you can look it up and find out more about it. The other thing I have to sort of highlight is that I also do a lot of my illustrations in MS Paint. I make no apologies for that. I like MS Paint. You'll see a lot of that. Some people find that more interesting than the OSINT. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, back to the topic, this super weapon that was on this slide. The video that was released was a bit blurred. Clearly, this is a good case study for image to text and text translation. It's also useful to have some Russian speakers around. I'm not going to go through in detail, but an image enhancement, it probably looks something like this. But seriously, there's a lot of information on the slide. No one really believes that this was a true leak. Everything has to be treated with suspicion. But the short and the most salient parts of this slide, it was introduced as Ocean Multi-Purpose System Status 6. That refers to the weapon in the middle of the torpedo. There were some stats on the slide, but in essence, it goes really deep, really fast, and it is ginormously large. I'm going to use terms like massive and ginormous all the way through this presentation. That's not exaggeration. That is the reality. That's what it is. To try to put it into context, if you think a normal torpedo that goes on a submarine is quite big, we call them heavyweight torpedoes. This torpedo, the Status 6 one, is about 30 times the size of a regular torpedo. And if you think that nuclear missiles like intercontinental ballistic missiles are big, this is about twice the size of one of those. So this is massive. And because of that, they need special submarines to carry them. And one of those submarines, the one highlighted, is called Belgorod. This talk is mostly going to be about Belgorod and what we know about her. She's really interesting. Again, she's massive, recurring theme. you can see that there's something underneath her and something on her back. And we're trying to figure out what that's all about. So starting with the torpedo herself, it was originally few years, that's what people called it. NATO, as far as we know, gives it the reporting name Canyon, and I'd actually been using that from before this leak. But more recently, it's taken the name Poseidon, so I'll use that going forward, else we'll get confused, because if you look her up now, it's called Poseidon. The Russians gave her that name a few years ago. It's a very large torpedo. What I've done in MS Paint underneath it is try to make sense of it. So that's an MS Paint sketch. You can see there's a nuclear warhead at the front. There's a nuclear reactor in the middle, and it goes to a pump jet at the back. Just some truth advertising. I say MS Paint, the sketch, at the bottom, you've got it with shading. That's in GIMP. I use GIMP as well, but primarily it's MS Paint. So this is an unusual torpedo. And when it was first released, partly because no one believed it was a true leak, it was treated with a lot of skepticism. There was a lot of disbelief. I think part of that was because the Russian government and newspapers, there was a lot of misinformation, particularly in the media. There was talk of it having 100 megaton warhead and cobalt salted and maybe going to create a sort of a radioactive tsunami that wipes out whole coastlines. That's an exaggeration and speculation that was treated as fact. So that's one side of it. But the bigger factor, I think, is simply that we don't understand it. Even now, even today, I can't say that I truly understand why Russia has built this. We've got plenty of theories. I can talk a lot about why I think it's built this weapon, but we don't know. And there's a tendency when you don't know something to say, it can't be true. We wouldn't build it, so it can't be true. It must be a fake. But I don't think it's a fake. And of course, we can turn to open source intelligence to figure this out. If you remember, it was leaked in 2015. Even before then, there were strong hints that Russia was building a super-sized torpedo. On the left-hand side, you've got a submarine called Sarov. Its main purpose is to test super-sized torpedoes. It was built about 2009 to fit a torpedo like that. And you can see the open gaping hole of the torpedo tube at the front there. The arrow points to it. On the right-hand side, you've got the upper photograph is, I believe, a test vehicle. So I've got a surrogate load for testing super-sized torpedoes. And you'll see that there's a special rig for lifting and lowering that into the water. That's above the torpedo and top right of the photograph, essentially. You can then see that in a Google Earth shot slightly behind my head. There's an arrow pointing to that same rig. That's on the quayside, and that photograph, this Google Earth image, was taken in 2010. So we'd actually known about this in open sources before the leak. We didn't know its name, we didn't know it's nuclear powered, we didn't have anything like the same details, but we did know it would offer supersized torpedo. So I always thought it was real. The submarine, Belgorod, which is the one on the top left, and apologies for my pronunciation of anything Russian. I'll try, but I'm not great. This submarine was much less in doubt. We did know of this beforehand. We knew that it's a special project. It's a converted Oscar II missile submarine. So during the Cold War, Russia was building missile submarines. At the end of the Cold War, it stopped building, and one of the unfinished ones is going to be changed from an original missile submarine into a new type of special mission submarine, described in 2012 by a chief of the commander-in-chief of the Russian Navy as a special project. That's usually a euphemism for spy submarines. And part of that is the blue submarine you see underneath it. So what you see on the original PowerPoint underneath the Belgorod, that is on the diagram is blue. That is a deep dive imaging submarine. So a mini submarine, but very large one. And on the back of the submarine, there's something, possibly a deep diving mini submersible, a second one like a rescue sub, or alternatively, it can be a payload, which is something that's going to be placed on the seafloor, such as a self-contained nuclear power plant. And we had good evidence of that. What I've done below is I took an image of the Oscar II submarine and I superimposed the elements on it, which would make it look more and more like the image in the PowerPoint. The red items are the Poseidon torpedoes that we talked about. And I guessed that they'd just be at the side of the submarine where the missiles used to be. I was wrong, but at the time, back in 2015, this was a pretty good guess. So we now want some open source intelligence that will flesh this out, will make it real and help us understand both what it is and the implications on naval warfare. Unfortunately, like a lot of things, we had a really long wait. There were a few years from 2015 to about 2019 where there were articles, I was writing articles, the Russian government was releasing information. There was nothing really very substantial. Then in April 2019, they launched the submarine, and the press was invited. This photograph is by Oleg Kuleshov. He takes some brilliant photographs of Russian submarines, particularly in the north. The press, like Oleg, were only allowed to take photographs of the back of the submarine. And that's quite interesting because anyone will probably tell you that the screws, the propellers at the back, are the most sensitive part of the submarine normally. And here you can see an arrow pointing to them. There's two of them on this submarine, and they're covered in canvas and metal shrouds. That's intended to stop you getting a close look. It partially works, let's say. But if that is the only part of the submarine they let you see, then what's going on up front that is even more secret than the screws on a normal submarine. There is a little bit of open source intelligence we can gather from this press released image. There's a bump, and I didn't know what that was. My best guess, even now, I don't know for sure. My best guess is it's something to do with thrusters to allow the submarine to hover in the water. That makes a lot of sense, but I can't be sure. If you zoom in, you can start to make sense of the panels. For me, what's most interesting, though, is that if you look closely at the lowest image just above my head, there is that bump present in that image, which is from the 2015 leak. So I'd originally treated that PowerPoint leak very suspiciously and thought that that image was only at best representative. But maybe it was more accurate than I realized. And I wish I'd paid more attention to it. To be honest, I could have done even better likeness. But if we want to find out about the submarine, and we're not going to just rely on the press releases and the few images that were officially allowed to be released, which only showed the back of the submarine, we're going to have to turn to other open sources. And a really good starter kit, a place, if you want to just go out and be an open source analyst on Russian submarines, Google Earth is a good start. A lot of people in defense space start in Google Earth. You probably know this, but it's a free app that allows you to view high-resolution satellite imagery all over the world. And if we look at Severodvinsk, which is where the submarine is being built, this image is available on Google Earth. It's from 2018, so it's before the submarine was launched. I chose it for that reason. It's by a satellite provider called Maxar, who take brilliant satellite images all over the world. It shows a lot of information. Just the main salient points for this. On the right-hand side, you've got where the submarine is being built. There's 4 construction sheds. They're the orange ones. The red one is the actual one where she's being built. And we worked that out based on the other submarines that are being built and by process of elimination, essentially. On the left-hand side, there's an area where the submarines are taken once they are launched. So that's where they're fitted out. So after they've launched, they take a couple of years while work is done on the inside of the submarine before it can start actual sea trials. And from the construction hall to where it's being fitted out, there is a floating dock. That's what the photo is at the top. It has to move. That's where that one is. The first step for the submarine to be launched is that that floating dock has to be moved from where it's normally parked to align to the construction hall, so that submarine can be brought out, loaded onto the dock. Then the dock is a floating dock, it moves and it goes out through the basin into the river, it sinks, the submarine is floated off, and then is with tugs and things is brought alongside the quay where it's then going to be fitted out. So if you were watching satellite imagery and you wanted a leading indicator that the submarine is about to be launched, you would watch that floating dock. And when that floating dock moves and is aligned, you'd say, aha, they're going to launch a submarine or ship, whatever, from this particular shed. Unfortunately, there is, Google Earth, I can generally only say good things about it. It's absolutely brilliant. Also, all the other mapping tools, there's competing basic mapping tools like Bing Maps, Google Maps, and Yandex and Apple. Check them all out. They have different imagery. They're all historic imagery. They're not there for OSINT analysts to get daily updates. So if you want something closer to real time, if you want to actually see a floating dock moving, the same day that it moves, then you need a different source. This is where it gets interesting, because there is a freely available satellite provider that any of you can access, that you can get almost daily updates of most places in the world. Sentinel-2 is a constellation of satellites, two satellites run by the European Space Agency. They have a really high revisit rate. It varies depending on where you are on the globe. Up north near the North Pole, it can be every other day. Sometimes there's a couple of day gap, and sometimes it's 2 days in a row. But it's almost every other day. For 2019, when the submarine was launched, even today, that is close to real time. Good news, generally things are getting better in that respect in terms of satellites, but you can have same day confirmation that something has changed. Also, this is in HackTheSea, so it's really relevant to say that Sentinel-2 covers much more of the world's oceans than most other image satellite providers. So that's great, and it's free to access. It's open source intelligence, easily accessible. The downside, the trade-off for such a high revisit rate is that it's very low resolution. It's about 10 meters per pixel, approximately. So you're going to get very blurred images, and you'll see that in what I'm about to share. Going back to our submarine being launched in Severodvinsk, this is an image taken by Sentinel a couple of days before. The floating dock I'm talking about is highlighted with that arrow. It's in the parked position. And just outside the basin, which is the sort of contained water where it's going to be launched into, there's a white triangle. That is snow-covered ice. So no one's going to launch a submarine today. And there's no submarines going out there without ice-breaking activity. The next day, literally the next day, there was another overpass, and the snow is already clearing. It's melting, essentially, I think. And the following day, the following satellite image, a couple of days later, actually, 23rd of April, we now know with hindsight that's the day the submarine was launched. You can see that the floating dock has actually moved down. It's now lower and aligned with the second of those sheds. So in the absence of anything else, even if there was no media covering the launch of the submarine, we would know the same day that something's up, that the submarine's likely to be launched. And this is proper open source intelligence, in my view, like real-time indicators of something that, even if it's not reported. The next day was disappointing. Cloud. So one of the obvious problems that all image satellites have is cloud. Cloud is the enemy of open source intelligence, really. Depending on where you are in the world, how often you get cloud and things you get, it does affect the ability to use satellites to track stuff. But fortunately, the following day, there was no cloud again, and we get a brilliant image of the floating dock outside of the basin. There's a couple, if you look closely, there's a couple of tugs just above it, maneuvering it. Belgorod is being brought out of the dock, and the next overflight, which is on the April the 30th, so a couple of days after launch, you can see Belgorod is now, the submarine is now in a position where it's going to be fitted out, and the dry dock has moved back. The enhanced image there is just to show, to make the submarine more clearer, is that long skinny thing, that's the submarine. So with these images, we can get an almost real-time understanding of what's going on. It's only one image per day, 2 days, but it's a completely different world to looking up in Google Earth. Clouds. So it was very frustrating when the cloud, when we get a day with clouds, especially when you're watching something very closely. But imagine if there was a satellite that could see through clouds. And of course, so you're probably ahead of me, there is radar satellites. So synthetic aperture radar satellites, there's a few out there. Most of them are not free to access, but one of them, Sentinel-1, so same European Space Agency, they give you a radar satellite that's free to access. It's very low resolution, and it's much lower revisit rate, but it still takes several images a month of most places. And this image is from the 29th of April, so just after launch, and you can see the floating dock, that's where the arrow is pointing to. This imagery, because of its low resolution, it doesn't always pick up submarines, but it usually picks up, it does sometimes pick them up, and it usually picks up ships for sure. So beyond just looking at movements in shipyards and movements in ports, you can obviously see ships in open water very well through cloud. And I would say that on its own, as an isolated source, it's not that useful. But as soon as you start combining it with other open sources, it's really powerful in the maritime world, and probably in other areas of open source intelligence as well. Something really cool that you can do, though, if you get these satellite images with radar, is you can take 2 or more of them and measure the differences. And you can start to highlight the changes. And that's what this is. This is a beta app that someone's building. And so 5 gigahertz exposure. This is the same time period when Belgorod was being launched. It didn't pick up Belgorod herself very well, probably because of her physical size isn't quite big enough for the resolution. But it does pick up 2 big red blobs. You see the big concentrations of red blobs? That is the floating dock being moved out and aligned to the actual the shed, and then subsequently the same floating dock being moved out into the water, into the river. So with this type of method, you would be aware of the movements broadly. This is really useful for measuring activity over time, patterns of activity at ports and maybe naval bases, things like that. Also shipyards in particular, I've had really good success measuring stuff at shipyards. So this is a really powerful tool. I'm sure there will be more tools like this out there. Just going back to high resolution satellite imagery, because obviously this has a lot of information in it. Google Earth, the free provider, the main provider of that, it's lagging, it's historic. They did start putting up images of Belgorod, quite a lot actually, but not for weeks, maybe months after. This image chronologically was the first of her. The image itself was taken on May the 14th, 2019, so a couple of weeks after launch by Airbus, which is another satellite provider. I don't know exactly when it was available on Google Earth, but certainly not for weeks, if not months afterwards. Once you've got high resolution satellite images, start measuring stuff. And that's particularly interesting when you've got a new submarine that's a bit of a history. So I've now got much more accurate measurements. That's what those white construction lines show. You'll notice that I'm not just measuring the overall length. I'm measuring details like the length to sail and the length of the sail. Also, I'm measuring the locations of hatches and similar things on the outside submarine that if I analyze, I can start to actually look inside the submarine. The hatches on the outside tell you something about the location of compartments and things like that on the inside. So what I was trying to do is understand what's inside. Taking that a bit further, I revised my estimates of what Belgorod was like. If you remember, originally I thought she was pretty much just a minimally converted Oscar II submarine, which is the top image. Now the bottom image, you see, I'm able to change all the dimensions based on the satellite image, make reasonable guesses as to what they've done to change the submarine, and the overall measurements. She is approximately 178 meters long overall. That is 584 feet or thereabouts. Makes her the longest submarine in the world. She's the second largest submarine in the world. The famous submarine Typhoon, the one that's in Huntover and that sort of stuff, that is still bigger by displacement, but it's shorter. The largest submarine in US history is the Ohio class ballistic missile submarine. They are big. They are kind of approaching the same length. They're shorter, but they're very long. They're nowhere near the same displacement. They are about 2/3 the displacement of this submarine. She's massive. So again, using the word massive a lot. You'll see that there's the mini sub underneath. That's now measured. And over on the right-hand side, there's me different speculative arrangements for the Poseidon torpedoes. I did think that the top one, which is like a rotary launcher, made the most sense. That turns out I was wrong again. The truth is probably closer to the bottom one, where you've got 2 sets of 3 torpedoes. Open source intelligence, you're often dealing with a lot of guesswork and a lot of contradictory or different parts of information that don't necessarily add up. And so you have to be willing to constantly revise your estimate. The bottom image is much closer to her. It's not perfect. If I drew her again now, it would be better. But at the time, this was the best information I had, and I made the safest estimates that I thought I could. There were no photos. You'd be surprised. Russia, as you can imagine, you don't have people running around taking photographs of submarines at naval bases and posting on the internet. It doesn't really happen. There were no photographs of her, almost. So this is the TASS news agency, the official news agency of Russia. The submarine that you see the big picture of, they posted about a submarine. That is a Typhoon class submarine. That's the only submarine in the world bigger than Belgorod. It's a brilliant submarine. It's fascinating in its own right. It's the one from Hunt for Red October and stuff like that. In the background, where that orange arrow is, that's the building that Belgorod was built in. So we can do geospatial analysis and figure out exactly where this photo was taken and say, that's where Belgorod was built. And if you zoom right into the background of that photograph of the Typhoon submarine, there's this. This is our first photograph of Belgorod. And the only photograph for many years, well, a couple of years anyway, a long time. And this added to our understanding, and I was able to revise and improve my estimates, but it's not much to go on. Mostly I was looking at satellite imagery. A lot of satellite imagery I'm looking at actually is not open source, if I'm honest. If you're willing to pay for it, or if you know the right people, you can get hold of images that by the same satellite providers, but are not through Google Earth. You just go straight and get the image. This particular one is from Airbus. It's from earlier this year. I think it's really cool. It's in snow, so it looks beautiful. Very Cold War feel, I hope you agree. I acquired this for a company called Shadow Break International. There are other providers, I'm sure. What's really good about this image from an intelligence perspective is, if you look at the front of the submarine, and there's that hexagon sort of is enhancement, you can see that there are 2 dark shadows, holes. They look like nostrils. They are the openings of the torpedo tubes. The outer doors of the Poseidon torpedo tubes are open. So this is how I knew, probably in February or March this year, that I was wrong about it having a single rotary launcher. There must be 2 sets of torpedoes, 3 on each side. So with this images like this, not just this one, but a whole bunch, I was able to constantly revise and improve our understanding of what Belgorod was like, and make some inferences into how she will operate and things like that. Just to cover off the super torpedo, the Poseidon weapon, over the same period of time, we had a load of information about her. There was actually some videos, and Putin and the Russian government put out some information about her as one of their super weapons. So we now know much more about Poseidon. There's some video footage of them, including being launched. The bottom image is one of my MS Paint MS Paint illustrations, not a cutaway, obviously. It was drawn to scale using pixels. You can see the size compared to a person. Maybe the operational object is a bit smaller than this, but it's still massive. This is not a normal torpedo. A lot of people describe it as a drone, as a autonomous underwater vehicle, and it has got some of those features, but I really suggest that we think of it as a big torpedo. It's carried in a torpedo tube, it's shot out when there's a war, and it's going to deliver a nuclear warhead, which is essentially a doomsday weapon. It is not going to be going around doing covert intelligence gathering or all the other things that we think that drones can do. There's just no evidence that they're building it that way, and the fact it's carried by a submarine in a torpedo tube is a pretty good indicator that that's just not the case. The mini submarine underneath it, we haven't dealt with this very much. So Belgorod carries a submarine underneath her. This, in naval terms, is a deep nuclear station. That's what the Russians call it. We abbreviate that to AGS. Obviously, the AGS is not the English spelling, but that's what we call it. That's what the Russians call it. It's carried by a host submarine. Belgorod is the biggest and latest of those. It's attached underneath. The host submarine carries it to where it's going to do its operations, and then it dives down. It leaves the host submarine above, dives down very deep, 1,000 meters or 3,000 feet at least, and it conducts missions on underwater infrastructure. So stuff like oil and gas or power infrastructure, internet cables. That's the one that gets the news. That's the one I use in the headlines, but all of these apply. Military communications, of course. Sensor network, so in old money, things like SOSUS you might have heard of, but the modern equivalents. And if these are Russian, then it can be putting them in place, it can be maintaining them, it can be delousing them maybe, but equally these could be someone else's. This is a submarine, it is capable of covert, we call it seabed warfare, messing with other people's seabed infrastructure. Mostly in the Arctic. It's a bit confusing because this mission, this capability almost contradicts the carrying of Poseidon weapons. If Poseidon is a nuclear deterrent, then the submarine shouldn't endanger the mission by starting doing spy stuff and putting itself essentially in threat. So it's a bit of a contradiction. It still has a lot of question marks in my mind as to what the submarine is really about. Is it about carrying a mini sub to this sort of stuff, or is it about carrying Poseidon? And why do both? Doesn't make sense. The deep diving submarine itself, this is Le Chagre, which is the main one. Pretty cool submarine in its own right. This is one of my MS Paint cutaways that I talked about. Very photo shy. There's lots of open source intelligence though, if you look hard enough. This is the end result of it, the analysis-based cutaway. And you'll see underneath it's got some yellow sort of skids, that's for sitting on the seabed. It's got manipulator arms at the front, that's for interfering with whatever's on the sea, in front of it on the seafloor. To live in these spherical pressure holes inside the outer hull. There's 7 in total, and the front 5 the crew live in, and the back 2 are for the nuclear power plant and the nuclear, the related propulsion, and the crew cannot move between the two. Submarines, very interesting, very advanced. It wasn't very well known until the 1st of July 2019. And tragically, there was a fire aboard and 14 of the crew died. These are very elite submariners. They're known as hydronauts in Russian Navy. That's very sad, and it's not clear whether the submarine, how quickly a submarine will be brought back into surface. But even if this is not carried out by Belgorod, then I'm confident that an equivalent submarine will be. There's a couple out there, and there's plenty of information on Russia's attempts to maintain this capability. Belgorod will, Losharik rather, will be brought back into service. That's the stated intention. So let's go back to open source intelligence and satellite images. Before, we were looking for indicators, leading indicators ideally, that the submarine was being launched. Now, after it's been sitting there at the pier for a couple of years, we're looking for indicators that it's going on to sea trials. That is newsworthy. If I'm honest, I wanted to be the first person to report that because I've been watching, so it'd be a bit disappointing if I missed it. About April this year, after the snow had melted and it's sort of the season for sea trials, I got quite excited when Belgorod seemingly disappeared. She was no longer at the quayside in the low resolution Sentinel imagery. This particular one is from the 29th of April, but it took a few days of where has Belgorod gone? Has she gone on sea trials? I was a bit suspicious. I nearly wrote an article, so Belgorod seems to have gone on sea trials, but I didn't quite trust it, and I held back. I'm really glad I did. One of the reasons that I was suspicious was if we use that same tool that I showed before that shows the difference in radar images, before it was red, now it's green. That's just because I've used different filters and settings, but you can see some movement. And while the left arrow, the one that's pointing downwards, it doesn't really pick up that she moved. She's too small, at least in some angles, but it does pick up the floating dock moving. And that didn't make sense to me. Why is the submarine, it's gone, but the floating dock also moved? So maybe instead of the submarine going on sea trials, they brought the submarine back into the shed for some reason. And that is exactly what they did. And a few days later, on May the 1st, that was confirmed. I think someone with a drone who takes wonderful photos and shares them on Instagram, took a rare photo of the shipyard and the area around where Belgorod is being built. You can see this on the left, you can see a few different submarines and ships and things, really great photograph. On the right, there's just a zoom in on that floating dock, and you can see Belgorod in the dock. This is literally the second photo I'd ever seen of Belgorod. And this is, a couple of years after she's been launched. So it really is very little photograph coming out at this point. That confirmed I was wrong. She hadn't started sea trials. She was indeed being taken back into the shed for some reason. A bit of a saga. I won't bore you with everyday satellite image, but over a course of time, she came back out, and eventually we got our reward. On June the 25th this year, Belgorod started sea trials, and I was able to write in navalnews.com that I was able to make a story that Belgorod, Russia's giant submarine, sails for the first time. I'm pretty confident that that's literally the first article in the world reporting that, and it's all thanks to open source intelligence, of course. Gave her a couple of hours grace and then reported this. In the hours after this article went out, photographs started appearing. These are from social media, Russian social media. There are some excellent photographs out there, and you can analyze them, as you can see, confirm understanding. So now, if after this talk you all go and Google Belgorod, you'll see loads of wonderful photographs of her. And remember that those are only from the last few weeks. all this open source intelligence I've been doing before was mostly on satellites because there were no photographs until she went for sea trials. No one really took any photographs of them. The last thing on the satellites, it doesn't really stop when she starts sea trials. During sea trials, we could find her on satellite imagery. So this is the same Sentinel satellite imagery. That blur on the left, that is her surfaced in the White Sea. It helps to know where to look, I guess, but we got her. And on the right, I got her again using the radar imagery. She did show up on this occasion, same day, similar place. There she is. These just look like blurs, so it might not be that exciting, but to an open source intelligence analyst who's been tracking her, this is pretty good stuff. To find a submarine in open water on sea trials, that's cool. So what does this all mean? We've got lots of satellite imagery, we've got a few photos now. Do we understand the submarine Belgorod? These are the MS Paint cutaways that I was doing. You see progression from 2015 at top down to earlier this year. And the first one was very much guesswork based on being a converted Oscar 2 submarine. And then you can see that I've just changed things around gradually over time as we learn more and more. The latest image, though, looks like this, much cleaner because now we've got good quality photographs. At the front, you've got a torpedo coming out. There's 6 Poseidon intercontinental nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed torpedoes. In the middle, underneath, you've got a deep diving mini sub that docks underneath, and on the back, you've got a place where another deep diving rescue sub essentially can be located. You've also got shown a payload such as a self-contained nuclear power plant, sort of thing that would be used to power underwater infrastructure. This cutaway is much less detailed than some of the other ones I draw. That's because we don't know very much. I'm actually really excited that I can guess how many decks she has. I'm a long way from guessing what's on those decks. But in future, I hope that we can flesh it out and make it much more accurate, such as like this. This one is the Typhoon. It's not my best one, to be honest, in terms of accuracy and completeness, but it's probably the most famous for sure. And I hope that in the future we can do illustrations like this. What I'll leave on, though, is just a sort of word of warning, word of caution. So I'm pretty prolific MS Paint, as I mentioned. On the left, you've got my sketch of another Russian submarine. It's a completely different one, a much smaller one called Piranha. On the right, you've got the Malaket Design Bureau, the people who designed that submarine, using, they stole my image off the internet and they used it in their brochure to sell the submarine. That's very flattering. I think that's really cool. But it then becomes someone else's OSINT. So my interpretation of submarine then suddenly becomes official in an unintended way and becomes evidence for other people. So you've got to be very careful, particularly with illustrations of these things. A lot of it might come from people like me speculating. And there are definitely other cases of this. So it's a bit of a circular reference when you're generating a lot of open source intelligence or writing it up at least on topics. But I still think it's really cool that they use my image. So thank you very much. That's everything I've got. And really, really glad that I can share this with you guys. Thank you.